It was Saturday morning, February 20th, 1943. The morning fog lay thick over the prairie of northern Texas and the rolling hills of southeastern Oklahoma. The fog was clinging to the fields and the tree lines. The sun had not yet burned through the mist, and the visibility in a few places was little more than a few hundred feet. At this time of year, locals in the area, farmers mostly, were used to either crisp, clear mornings or the bluster of a winter wind. But this morning was different. The fog felt like it would take a while to burn off, if it ever did. Above that fog, somewhere in the pale early morning light, 12 small aircraft, American-built, Texas-built AT-6 advanced trainers, each with a student pilot and a student navigator, were flying a training mission. The young pilots, no more than students who were early in their flight training, were searching for a break in the blanketing mist. These pilots weren't from Oklahoma or from neighboring Texas. They weren't even American. They were young British airmen, cadets of the Royal Air Force, training thousands of miles from home. Somewhere up there, in the limited visibility, the group of 12 airplanes got separated by the fog. There was a group of 3 and then there was a group of 2. But soon, each of those 3 airplanes found themselves alone in the fog, each desperately looking for a way out, looking for a patch of blue sky above, or perhaps a hole in the fog that would allow them to get below the clouds so that maybe they could take a chance at an emergency landing, somewhere, anywhere. Moments later, the quiet of the early morning was shattered by a sound that echoed across the hills. The low, rising whine of engines, a sudden, thickening thud, and then it was silent. This is the story of those British cadets who crashed in Oklahoma on February 20th, 1943. It was a tragedy born of fog and fate, of war and friendship, and of a training program that brought a small piece of London, England, to a small Texas town named Terrell. It also brought the burial of 4 British cadets and a memorial erected nearly 60 years later by students of a different kind. Elementary school students who learned of the nearby plane crashes in their reading class while at school. This is Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Gorham. I'm a retired meteorologist with a career in the United States Air Force, commercial and broadcast weather forecasting, with a specialty of aviation meteorology. I've created this podcast series to bring you interesting but tragic stories of airplane crashes that have either been caused by the weather or when the weather has been a contributing factor to the crash. Today's episode, When British Cadets Fell from the Oklahoma Sky, is about the tragic and unfortunate crash of 2 military training aircraft, each with 2 student pilots aboard. The students were British, and they were thousands of miles from home. But with World War II raging over the European continent, there really was no safe place in Britain for flight training. So the British leadership turned to America for not only safe and war-free training, but for assistance in training its young pilots. Unfortunately, on this day, the training ended in death for 4 of these young students. In this episode, we'll talk more about the students and their training program, and why, of all places, Texas and Oklahoma were selected for the British flight training program. We'll talk about the airplane, one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II. Plus, we'll talk about the terrain of this rural area, and of course, we'll talk about the weather. It was fog, after all, that obscured the ground below and destined the students to their fate. But we'll also talk about the other aircraft that were part of this training mission and the different decisions that the young pilots made that allowed them a different fate, one of unremarkable landings and survival. Unremarkable landings are, after all, the best kind. We'll also talk about the other students of this story, the young elementary school students who, while on a reading assignment at school, discovered the deaths of these British students so many years before. It was their efforts and dedication that led to the erecting of a granite marker at the crash site on Big Mountain, Oklahoma. It was this marker that a motorcycle buddy of mine discovered while riding one day recently, and he said to me, "Hey, this might be a good story for your podcast." Turns out he was right, and here we are. Later, near the end of the podcast, I'll share some new podcast statistics and I'll update you on a few other items as well, including a shout out to some of our newest listeners. With that, let's begin and take a look at the crash of the two AT-6 Texan aircraft from the number 1 British Flying Training School in Terrell, Texas, and the weather on that foggy Saturday morning in southern Oklahoma more than 80 years ago. We'll start by explaining why the British were learning to fly in Texas and Oklahoma. Let's first set the stage by remembering what was happening in Europe at the time of this accident. It was 1943. There was still about a year and a half to go before World War II officially came to an end. And though the German army had just surrendered in Stalingrad about 3 weeks before this crash, the war was far from being decided. In fact, the Americans were in the midst of their first major defeat in North Africa, and it wasn't until just a week after this crash that American bombers finally launched their raids into Germany, an effort that would eventually help turn the tide of the war. Obviously, this was not a good time for student pilots to take to the skies over England. Although there were British cadets learning to fly there, in the safest locations possible, of course. It's just that the sheer numbers of students that needed to be trained for the war were overwhelming the amount of safe sky that England could provide. So they branched out, and in 1941, the United States offered 7 locations, 1 each in Florida, Arizona, and California, and 2 each in Oklahoma and Texas. These new British flying training schools were critical for Britain. The Battle of Britain had ended just a few months before, and although this decisive battle proved that the Royal Air Force could beat the German Luftwaffe, it came at a tremendous cost. Not only were there more than 1,500 RAF aircraft lost, but more than 500 pilots were killed. It was imperative to get as many students as possible, and as quickly as possible, into flight schools so that they could join the fight over the UK and Europe. At the time, America was still neutral in the war. The official entry, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, would come at the end of 1941 on December 7th. Therefore, it was perfect to send British flight cadets to the quiet skies of America for training. Perhaps you noticed, all of those British flying training school locations I mentioned were in the southern United States. This was critical, as the prevailing weather conditions would allow the maximum number of flying days per year. In fact, the last air base where I was stationed, Altus Air Force Base, was also a flight training base in Oklahoma. This part of southwestern Oklahoma enjoyed more than 300 flight training days per year, ideal for training pilots. Another advantage this region had was the relatively flat terrain. And that was not the case in the part of Oklahoma where these cadets crashed. But I'll talk more about that in a few moments. This program, the one that brought British cadets to America to learn to fly, was known as the Arnold Scheme, named after General Henry Hap Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Corps. The arrangement allowed British students to learn to fly in relative safety, away from German attacks and away from the high amounts of operational air traffic over England, but also to benefit from America's vast open spaces, abundant aircraft, and a cadre of civilian American instructors. Civilian instructors who, soon enough, would no longer be civilian. The students involved in this crash were assigned to the largest of the 7 schools, the number 1 British Flying Training School. It was located in Terrell, Texas, about 30 miles east of Dallas. The school trained pilots in the Stearman PT-17 biplane, as well as the AT-6 Texan. More than 2,200 cadets trained in Terrell in the 4-year period that the school was open. That would be from June 1941 through September of 1945. And so Terrell, once a quiet Texas town, became, in the words of one local newspaper, a little piece of England transplanted to the Texas plains. RAF cadets were excited to come to a land that they thought was still home to cowboys and Indians, and they were somewhat disappointed when they learned that those days had ended long ago. The excitement, however, outweighed what actual disappointment there may have been. At the training base as well as in town, the Union Jack flew beside the Stars and Stripes. The cadets wore RAF uniforms, so they were easy to identify. The townspeople opened their homes to the cadets and even learned to make tea the British way, the proper British way, which includes boiling the water just once, steeping loose-leaf tea for 4 to 5 minutes, and then adding milk to a strong tea or lemon to a light tea. For a time, Terrell really did feel like London, complete with its fog. And that's the perfect segue to switch gears and talk about the weather on this foggy Saturday in February 1943. The weather played a crucial role in the events of that morning. Unlike most months of the year, February in central Oklahoma can be difficult to predict. Caught between winter's chill and spring's approach, temperatures can vary quite a bit, usually spiking up just before the arrival of a cold front and then plunging as the cold front passes. Average highs hover in the 50s to near 60, with lows in the 30s overnight. Those cold fronts, with the northerly winds, can bring frost, even snow, while the southerly winds can pull in warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, about 250 miles or 400 kilometers to the south. In Celsius, by the way, those temperatures range from highs in the low to middle teens to overnight temperatures near zero. The terrain of this area did not help the training flight. The rolling hills of southeast Oklahoma trapped moisture and cool air and, from my perspective, and with the right conditions, made valley and low-level fog all but unavoidable until the sun had a chance to warm things up. I mentioned earlier that one of the advantages of the airbase where I was stationed in Oklahoma is that the terrain is primarily flat. That is in southwestern Oklahoma, not southeastern Oklahoma, where this crash occurred. Flat terrain makes the weather forecast, especially the wind forecast, a little bit easier to predict. It doesn't eliminate the possibility of fog, but it is easier to forecast. I think if you ask most Americans about the terrain of Oklahoma, they will say it's flat. And to a large degree, that's true, probably due to the old cowboy movies that combine scenery of not just Oklahoma, but neighboring Texas and Kansas. To call Oklahoma flat, though, is to do the state a disservice. Southeastern Oklahoma is, to me, gorgeous. The part of the state is dominated by the Ouachita Mountains, which are characterized by rugged, rocky, and forested regions with numerous lakes and rivers, plus long and unusually oriented east-west mountain ridges and valleys. The area where this crash occurred is the most mountainous and heavily forested part of Oklahoma, very much the opposite of the terrain on the other side of the state, where I spent almost 4 years while in the Air Force. Not only is there a large difference in the terrain between eastern and western Oklahoma, there can be a large disparity in humidity. Where the western regions are typically dry, if not very dry, the eastern regions are relatively humid. You can see this difference for yourself. Look at the state of Oklahoma on Google Earth, and you'll notice the western 2/3 are brown, similar in color to a large part of Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, and Colorado, while the eastern third of the state is a greenish color, indicative of the higher humidity and more representative, perhaps surprisingly so, of the Google colors of Louisiana and a large part of the southeastern United States. Meteorological records describe that day when the crash occurred as calm, as well as humid. Midday temperatures were in the 60s, or the mid to upper teens Celsius, but it was chilly in the morning. There was a cold front lying across the state from northeast to southwest, dividing Oklahoma nearly in half. Mild and humid to the east where the crash occurred, cooler and drier to the west. There were no thunderstorms, there was no snow. But east of the cold front, thick fog lingered through the mid-morning hours, reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile in some areas. That's about 400 meters. For experienced instrument-rated pilots, fog like that can be challenging, but manageable. For cadets still learning the basics of flight control and navigation, however, it can be fatal. I looked at the weather maps for the next day. Had this flight taken place just 24 hours later, the conditions would have been much less dangerous, in fact, not dangerous at all. The cold front had pushed through, changing the air mass over southeastern Oklahoma. There was much less humidity and no fog. The conditions responsible for the crash were gone. The winds were gusty out of the north, so there could have been some low-level mountain wave turbulence caused by the winds blowing across the mountains, but nothing too strong, and it could have even been a good training situation for the students. What about the weather forecast? The forecast was not out of line with the conditions that the student pilots encountered, although the conditions began to worsen after takeoff. It appears that this was unexpected, as the instructors at the school attempted to radio the students in flight to inform them of those worsening conditions. It's not known if the transmission was received by all of the students, but several did turn back to their departure base, and several more successfully reached their destination. But 2 planes crashed, and a 3rd plane nearly crashed. The original training mission included 12 aircraft and 24 crew members. Fog in the mountains is notoriously difficult to forecast, even today. It takes a seasoned forecaster to understand the ridges and the valleys of any given mountain range, and where the humidity might be trapped, and where the temperatures are slow to rise in the early morning shadows. Changing wind directions and humidity levels must also be considered. Visibility can worsen or improve dramatically and quickly. A pilot can find him or herself in a valley with only patchy fog, and then, seemingly in the blink of an eye, the fog closes in and obscures the safe exit. This then brings into question the decision-making capabilities of the student pilots. Being briefed about the weather forecast is one thing, but knowing what to do when experiencing deteriorating weather conditions is something else entirely. Standard procedures for training flights includes a pre-flight briefing, which does include a weather briefing. That said, the exact details of this flight briefing are not known, though I'm sure there was a weather component. Since the pilots were students, did they fully understand the weather conditions that they would encounter along the way? That too is unknown. In 1943, aviation weather technology relied on ground-based observations, teletype reports, and basic forecasts from what was then called the U.S. Weather Bureau. Weather observations from around the area were taken into consideration, and all the pilots, students or otherwise, are briefed on those conditions before takeoff. In those days, there was no onboard radar, nor any advanced instruments. Pilots relied on visual references and their radios for weather updates. Part of the student classroom instruction included an understanding of basic meteorology. Real-time insight of the weather for students was, and is, critical. To be able to look at the clouds, know the winds, and have some knowledge of the temperature and humidity trends adds to a pilot's success in the cockpit. Unfortunately, this limited capability contributed to frequent weather-related accidents during World War II training. And not just for British students in America, but for flight students around the world. By limited capability, I mean both the state of the technology in 1943 and the understanding of the weather from the pilot's perspective. Aviation weather has advanced so much since the 1970s into the 1980s and 90s. Prior to then, there was much that was not understood. The irony of the weather conditions on that day was not lost on those who later reflected on the crash. This fog, the kind that clung to the hills of Oklahoma that day, was very familiar to the young men from England. It was the same kind of fog that often blanketed their homes near London, thousands of miles away. It was that fog that allowed Terrell, Texas to become Little London during the war years. That and a cup of proper British tea. I mentioned that one of the Texan airplanes nearly crashed. The 2-man crew of student pilot and student navigator found themselves trapped in the Kiamichi Valley with fog all around. They wisely chose to make an emergency landing in a farmer's field rather than to attempt to climb out of the unfamiliar valley with such restricted visibility. The other 2 aircraft, now separated from each other as well as from the original group of 12, continued for a short period of time. The end of their mission, however, was not as fortunate. The second plane crashed into the steep, rugged southern slope of White Rock Mountain. Blinded by the fog, it appeared that the aviators flew right into the side of the mountain. The cadet navigator, Frank Frostick, was killed immediately, but it's possible the cadet pilot, Vincent Cockman, survived for a short period of time before succumbing to his injuries. The third plane lost control and spiraled down into the Oklahoma mountain known as Big Mountain. It was apparent from the impact site that the plane was traveling straight downward when it crashed. Cadet pilot Mike Hosier and cadet navigator Maurice Jensen died instantly. The exact route of this training mission is unknown, but with the cadets traveling mostly northward from Terrell, Texas to Miami, Oklahoma, Big Mountain is more or less on what would be considered the direct route. White Rock Mountain, however, is well off the estimated route and is about 45 miles east of Big Mountain. It's surprising that this plane was so distant, 45 miles from the Big Mountain crash. This plane was well off what I assume was the direct route to Miami. White Rock Mountain has an elevation of 1,023 feet, that's 311 meters. Big Mountain is slightly taller and has an elevation of 1,145 feet, almost 382 meters. The aircrew from the plane that landed in the field, as it turned out, were not far from the Big Mountain crash. These two students were able to assist with the search for the then still missing pilots on Big Mountain the next day. The crash site did take some time to find. Let's talk about the airplane involved in this crash, because it's one that has had a remarkable career, one that spans almost 90 years, from when it first took to the skies in 1935 to today, where many examples still fly in air shows around the United States and around the world. If you've attended an air show, there's a very good chance you've seen AT-6s flying in aerial battle recreations, or perhaps you've been able to get up close to a Texan parked on the ramp. Don't let its mission as a trainer lull you into the impression that it's some sort of meek or mild airplane. It is not. I had the fortunate opportunity to fly in a Texan, one that was outfitted to look like a Mitsubishi A6M0. This is going back a few years, but I flew in a commemorative Air Force Air Show practice session that recreated the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy. That, I will honestly say, was a 45-minute experience that will remain vivid in my memory for many more years to come. We flew the whole Tora 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 routine, which is a popular recreation that takes place at air shows across the United States every year. My flight included all the dives, rolls, loops, explosions, smoke, noise, and smells of the real show. Had that Tora 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 routine been 29 minutes instead of 30 minutes, my breakfast would have stayed where it was supposed to stay. But my breakfast and I parted ways when we were lining up on the runway to land as the practice session was concluding. I'm happy to say none of my breakfast landed on the inside of that immaculate AT-6, but exactly where it landed is a story for another time. Speaking of the Japanese Zero, these two planes, the Zero and the Texan, are remarkably similar in appearance despite their dramatically different roles and their designs by engineers on opposite sides of the globe. The Texan as a trainer and the Zero as a carrier-based fighter and bomber. In any head-to-head competition, a Zero would thoroughly overwhelm a Texan. In real-world battle conditions, the two airplanes never faced off against one another, and that is a very good thing for any Texan pilot. The Texan was known in the U.S. Navy as the SNJ and as the Harvard in Britain. The SNJ stands for Scout, Navy, and the J was a designator for the manufacturer, North American Aviation. It was a single-engine advanced trainer, that was the AT part. It was produced from 1935 to 1952 with over 15,000 built. In addition to the U.S. Army Air Forces and the U.S. Navy, the Texan was used by allies like the Royal Air Force. In post-World War II years, it served in conflicts like Korea, and it was also used as a counterinsurgency aircraft. Today, it is estimated that there are approximately 500 Texans in airworthy condition, and most of them, like the one I flew in, are used in airshow demonstrations or are on static display and used for special flights or occasions. The AT-6 served as the training classroom for hundreds of thousands of pilots from the U.S. and other countries. The plane was called, quote, an honest challenge, unquote. because although it was challenging to fly, it prepared pilots for the more complex and powerful fighters and bombers that they would next fly in combat. Many pilots attributed their success in fighter aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress to the AT-6. This two-seater was versatile, rugged, and dependable. Although it was primarily used as a training aircraft, it did see some combat duty in World War II, the Algerian War, the Ifni War that was in Spain in the late 1950s, the Indo-Pakistani War in 1971, and the South African Border War, which took place from the mid-1960s until 1990. The Texan moniker comes from the fact that the vast majority of these airplanes were manufactured at the North American Aviation Plant in Dallas, Texas, only a few miles from where the British cadets were training in Terrell, and only about 150 miles or 240 kilometers from the crash site. Let me take this opportunity to introduce you to the young military men who were killed on that foggy mountain in Oklahoma. Vincent Henry Cockman was born July 2nd, 1922, in Ilford, Essex, England. He was 20 years old when he died. Vincent came of age in the shadow of the Blitz, as his hometown was bombed relentlessly by the German Luftwaffe. Like much of England, Ilford residents endured blackouts, rationing, and had to carry identification cards at all times. Children carried gas masks and knapsacks in case of evacuation. Vincent was described as quick-witted and mechanical, and he excelled in his early training. His letters home, still preserved by his family, shared his excitement for being in America and flying the American skies. Vincent's navigator was Frank Robert Wilfred Frostick. Born in 1920, he was 22 years old and the oldest of the 4 students who were killed. Frank came from a rural background, and his sharp intellect steered him toward navigation. RAF records note his precision with maps, ironically, a skill he sharpened in England's foggy fields. Frostick was from an area well northeast of London called North Walsham. North Walsham was not so heavily bombed like so much of the area, but it was heavily fortified to repel and halt a possible invasion from the sea by the German army. The Germans, it was thought, would likely become yet another invading force, as this area had been at risk of invasion for hundreds of years. Michael John Minty Hosier was born in 1923. Of the 4 killed, he was the youngest at 19. He had an adventurous streak and tinkered with model airplanes as a boy. He volunteered early for RAF service. His letters home spoke of Texas hospitality and dreams of coming home to fly Spitfires, the dominant fighter of the time. Maurice Leslie Jensen was also 19. It was said that Maurice brought a calm demeanor to the cockpit, his navigation skills complemented by a love of literature. From the coastal town of Bournemouth, he adapted quickly to the Texas prairies. Like many towns in England, Bournemouth was bombed heavily with many civilian casualties between 1940 and 1944. The town is noted as serving as one of the staging areas for the D-Day invasion of France. And today, Bournemouth attracts more than 5 million visitors annually to enjoy its coastline and resort-like atmosphere. Let me say that I've enjoyed learning about these boys. I live in Texas today and previously lived in Oklahoma. I am familiar with the areas where they trained and where they died. I very much enjoyed learning that they were excited to be training here. One day soon, I hope to visit the memorial monument that my friend Max came upon that prompted him to suggest this story to me. I'd also like to attend the annual memorial service in Terrell at the No. 1 British Flying Training School Museum. I also enjoyed the fact that there was so much information to be found on these cadets, especially when considering that the previous episode of Radar Contact Lost, when TWA Flight 6963 crashed while trying to find a dark airport, had so little of that kind of information available. The TWA crash happened in 1946, yet I don't even think I could find the age of the TWA co-pilot, or if either the pilot or the co-pilot had any military service, even when that was only a year to 2 years after the war had ended. Yet with these cadets, I found where they were born, where they grew up, the names of their parents, even some insight into what made each of them tick. This made the whole story much more personal to me, and perhaps to you as well. We're coming to the end of this episode, but let's talk about the monument erected for these airmen. As I mentioned, it was this memorial that brought this story to my attention. And it has an interesting story, as they often do, primarily because it wasn't organized or erected by a country or even by fellow airmen mourning and honoring their own. It was built by school children who stumbled upon the story practically in their backyard almost 60 years afterward. In 2000, a group of students from a small elementary school in Rattan, Oklahoma, near Big Mountain, were inspired by their town's World War II history. They were surprised at the realization that many in their own town knew nothing of the crash. After reading the story in school, the students decided to erect a marker at the crash site. They considered it sad that 4 grieving families had been left in England during the war with no sense of proper closure related to the deaths of their sons in America. The memorial site on Big Mountain is much more accessible than the crash site on White Rock Mountain. As it turned out, the local rescuers, the ones who took part in the 1943 rescue, and who at the time of the children's research were then in their 70s and 80s, were unable to take the students to the more rugged and steep White Rock Mountain location. So it was easy to make the decision that the monument should be located on Big Mountain. Fortunately, the site is adjacent to an old dirt logging road, so the access is relatively easy. My buddy Max and another buddy Mike made the 6-mile off-road excursion on their motorcycles. Max, who was riding his BMW adventure bike, reported that the trip was fun. Mike, who was riding his vintage Honda Pacific Coast, a motorcycle much less suited for off-road riding, said that this trip up the gravel road was not really that much fun. But learning the story of the student airmen more than made up for it. In addition to the monument, the students undertook the daunting task of locating surviving family members in England, and again, they were successful. Families of all 4 airmen were found, in addition to John Wall and Wilbur Wright, the cadet aviators who made the emergency landing in the farmer's field near the Big Mountain crash site. Mr. Wall, in the years after the war, had moved to New Zealand, which added a bit more determination to the students' efforts. Wilbur Wright, by the way, Wilbur was just a nickname. There was no relation to the Wilbur Wright, who was one half of the American flight pioneer brothers. Soon, word of the new monument reached British Airways and Air New Zealand. British Airways donated 18 free tickets for the students to use, and Air New Zealand offered to fly Mr. Wall to Dallas. The students used the British Airways tickets to fly family and survivors to Dallas, and then they arranged additional transportation to the rural site in Oklahoma. Several members of the British Press Corps accompanied the flight, including reporters from the BBC, the Daily Telegraph, and the Daily Mail newspapers, as well as a local Terrell newspaper. The memorial marker was dedicated on February 20th, 2000. The 57th anniversary of the crash landings. According to guest registers, over 1,000 people crowded onto the mountaintop for the ceremony. News of the occasion was broadcast throughout England and reported in many newspapers around the world. To mark the 75th anniversary, a rededication of the monument occurred in 2018. Britain's Consul General to the United States, along with a group of RAF officers and their families, as well as visitors from England, a group from Terrell, and local residents around Big Mountain, gathered at the crash site. School children from Rattan sang "God Save the Queen" and placed flowers at the marker. About 120 miles south in Terrell, where the cadets were stationed, a group of students from Terrell High School designed and built a monument to honor the 80 British cadets who died while training in the United States. The monument stands at the Oakland Memorial Park Cemetery in Terrell, a striking granite structure etched with the names of the fallen, including Cockman, Frostick, Hosier, and Jensen. Each year, local citizens, veterans, and visiting British officials gather in Terrell to pay tribute. This year's ceremony was held while I was researching this story, and I should say not only researching, but learning of this story. The ceremony happened just 3 days before I discovered it. The number 1 British Flying Training School Museum in Terrell, located in one of the original airport hangars, preserves artifacts, photographs, log books, uniforms, training manuals, and letters written home by the cadets, all of it capturing the optimism and courage of the young men. If you're ever near the Dallas area and can drive or fly over to Terrell, I think you'll find the museum interesting. A fun fact about this unique time in Texas history is about the women in Terrell who were asked to train the British pilots between 1941 and 1945. Many of the male instructors were now flying in the war, either in Europe or the Pacific, so most of the remaining flight instructors were women. This was the situation not only in Terrell, but around the United States. And this was such an interesting occurrence in Terrell that a book was written about it. Titled Girls of Flight City by Lorraine Heath, it is a novel inspired by the women who became the flight instructors and who helped with the overall training of the British cadets, as well as the true events of Terrell, referred to in the book as the fictional town of Terrace, Texas, around this time period. That's all for this time on Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. Thanks for listening, but don't go just yet. I want to share a few more things with you, as well as some new podcast statistics. If you'd like to learn more about not only this crash, but about the training of the Royal Air Force in Texas, then in addition to the novel Girls of Flight City, you can read the book The Royal Air Force in Texas, Training British Pilots in Terrell During World War II. Both books are available on Amazon. There are also a number of newspaper articles from the day of and the day after the two crashes. Those newspapers include the Daily Oklahoman, which is now called The Oklahoman, also the Terrell Tribune, and Tulsa World. There was other reference material as well, including a letter written in 1998 by John Wall. He was the pilot who landed successfully in the farmer's field on that foggy morning. The letter was written to Henry Madgwick, another former British flyer. I found this interesting. Mr. Madgwick later became a naturalized American citizen and then the mayor of Terrell. Mr. Madgwick was one of the original founders of the number 1 British Flying Training School Museum at the airfield in Terrell. If you're a road traveler and have the famed and historic Route 66 on your bucket list, then check out the Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery, which dates back to 1899. This cemetery is located on Route 66 on the north side of Miami in the northeastern corner of Oklahoma. It's adjacent to the Miami airport. The number 3 British Flying Training School was located at the Miami airport and was the destination of the cadets from Texas before they got lost in the fog and crashed. Among the thousands of graves spread over 18 acres, there are 15 somber headstones, all in a row, each one signifying the resting place of a young British airman. If you'd like to see the number 1 British Flying Training School Museum, then visit thetexasbucketlist.com. The Texas Bucket List is an independently produced TV show about all the things to see, do, and eat here in Texas. You can find them on YouTube. They featured the number 1 British Flying Training School Museum in Terrell in their Season 14, Episode 10 edition. The enjoyable segment is about 7 minutes in length. And now some notes about Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. Our most recent episode, when TWA Flight 6963 crashed while trying to find a dark airport, fell a few downloads short of the 7-day download record held by the episode uploaded just prior to that one, when UPS Flight 1354 crashed into the ground more than a mile from the runway. However, the slow start gained momentum and took the top spot on the 30-day download chart. There's still more than a month to go on the 90-day chart, at least as of this recording. And it's nearing the top, so maybe soon we'll have a new 90-day download leader. We'll cross our fingers for that. And let me make a correction to what I reported in the previous episode. The all-time download record holder is not when Colgan Air Flight 3407 fell out of the sky in Buffalo, New York. That's actually the number 2 all-time downloaded episode. The number 1 episode of Radar Contact Lost is the very first episode I published back when I didn't really know what I was doing. Season 1, Episode 1, that is titled When the B-25 Crashed into the Empire State Building. That episode has been online longer than any other, so maybe it makes sense that it's had the most downloads. But I think it's still a pretty good one, no matter how long it's been online. If you haven't listened to either of those episodes, check them out, then tell your friends to check them out too. On Instagram, follow @Radar Contact Lost Podcast. There I provide pictures, behind the scenes, some time schedules, interesting factoids, and more. We're also on Facebook. If you'd like to reach out, send an email to rclpodcast1@gmail.com. That's rclpodcast1@gmail.com. Or send a text through your podcast app. Your name and contact information used on the texting app remains anonymous. I'd love to hear from you. Let me take a moment to thank you, the listeners. Your listens, your downloads, your likes, your comments, your reviews, all of it helps Radar Contact Lost move up in the rankings and helps this podcast get in front of people who otherwise might not have already learned about it. The easiest way to help get the word out is to click that like button. A bit less easy, perhaps, is to leave a comment. But those comments are even more valuable, and I appreciate it very much. Now, let me give a quick shout out to some of our newest listeners in Lockhart, Texas, barbecue capital of Texas, I will add. Harare, Zimbabwe. Is that right, Harare, Zimbabwe? Well, how cool is that? We also have new listeners in Arden, North Carolina, and Brookhaven, Pennsylvania. Thanks for the privilege of your time and for taking a chance on this podcast. I hope you come back for more. With each new episode of Radar Contact Lost, I will bring you interesting but tragic stories of plane crashes from across the United States and from around the world. When these crashes involve the weather as a possible cause or as a contributing factor, I'll rely on my 40-year career as an Air Force, broadcast, and commercial meteorologist with a specialty of aviation meteorology to explain what happened and why. I'll also lean on my team of experts in meteorology, air traffic control, and piloting to peel back the curtain to take a closer look at what really happened. I'm excited with every upload of every new episode, and I hope you are too. I'm very happy to bring these stories to all of you who have a love of weather, aviation, and history, just like me. Thanks for climbing aboard and settling in for the latest from the Radar Contact Lost team of Chris, Cindy, Michael, Tony, First Officer Larry, and Captain Michelle, and me. I'm Dave Gorham.